Hey everybody, we're going to be doing another recipe today. This is going to be Svíčková. This is one of the great Czech dishes. It's an amazing dish. It's essentially tenderloin with sauce. And let's dive right into it. I mean, this is going to be an amazing dish. One thing that's going to be different than perhaps other sites is that we're going to go through the whole process of making the meat, the sauce, and the knedlíky, which go along with it. So you're going to actually learn how to make the bread as well as all the rest of it. Because when I'm making this particular meal, there's a good few hours right in the middle, which is perfect to make the dumplings that go with this meal. And so we're going to do all those things in this recipe. So we're going to start by cutting up the vegetables. We use pretty standard root vegetables. We're going to be using carrots and onions and celery. Typically you'd use celery root, but celery tastes just pretty much the same. And we're going to use parsnips, and we do a couple cups of those. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Anyone will tell you who's made this over the course of their life that you should just put as many in as you want. What tastes good to you. So I typically do 3 to 4 cups because the sauce is one of my favorite parts. And so for the recipe on the screen, there's 2 cups, but I'm making it again this week and I'm using 4 cups. I just like to have tons of that sauce. And so it's up to you. Really decide how much you want to put. So you're going to put the butter in the pan, you're going to put the vegetables in, you're going to cook them for a little while until they start to change color, and then we put in the meat. Now this meat, it's up for debate again. Sirloin, tenderloin, that's the traditional fancy cut of meat for this. But again, that's a more expensive cut of meat. And so most of the time, if you're just making this meal for yourself on an average weeknight or a weekday, you'd use a cheaper piece of beef, typically from the rump. In this case, we're doing a rump round roast, and it turned out fine. It turned out great. What you do is you're going to cut into it, and you're going to put the bacon into little pockets. I would say the longer version of this recipe would have you put the bacon in, and then you put the vegetables around it, put some of the seasoning on it, store it overnight, and then you would cook it. But you can also do a shorter version where you just do that all in one day. So you just cook the vegetables, put the meat in. You're going to rotate the meat so it kind of pan sears it all around, just to cook the outer part of it. And then we put in our boiling water. You don't want to put in cold water. You want to put in water that's about the right temperature of what you're already cooking. And then from there, we put in some of our extra seasoning, our spices, the allspice, the thyme. And you put that on top of the meat and stir it in to all the different parts. And then you put the lid on it, put it in the oven, 325 degrees. And depends on how big your piece of meat is. Typically, hour for pound or longer. So it's gonna, typical piece like this that you have on the video took about 3.5, 4 hours to cook that. It probably could have gone longer, but the key for this particular method, you don't have to have it covered in water, but you want to have enough in there, and then I put the lid on it. And so that's going to keep it moisturized, and it's going to tenderize it as it goes. You could do other methods of this. You could roast it or boil it. But in this case, we're oven cooking it with enough liquid and with the lid on it so that it can just go. Now, that's really it for that part of the recipe. Once you're at that phase, we start doing the bread. Now, the type of knedlíky I'm making is just the plain white flour knedlíky. We're using yeast, but we're not adding in the dried bread. And that's one of those options you can do. I do find that a lot of pubs that would have Svíčková, you would just get the plain knedlíky without all the other fancy stuff in them. It's kind of like the cheap, easy way to do it. But it's so good. It can mop up the sauce just perfectly. And I think that in this case, it's the one that makes the most sense, even though it's super easy to make other kinds of knedlíky. These are some of the most light, fluffy version of knedlíky, and so I think it works perfectly for this dish. The bread is really, really easy. You're going to have your flour. In the U.S., I'm using Wonder flour. It works great for this, but I've also tried all-purpose, and if you get the right amount of moisture in there, it works actually decently. It's just going to be salt and an egg and the flour, and then we do milk with yeast. We go for the 10-minute development of the yeast as it rises, and then we mix it all together. You want the dough to stick together, be a blob, but not be too sticky on your hands. So either really mix it well, or if it turns out to be too dry, add a little moisture. Figure it out for your elevation, etc., your climate. Once you have that, then you're going to let it rise. Just put the cloth over it. The meat is cooking in the oven. The dough is rising for the bread. Go read a book or watch TV or whatever you want to do. Come back after the rising period. It should at least have doubled in size. And then we're going to pull it out. We'll cut it into the different loaves. I get 4 loaves off of this. So I cut it fairly evenly, shape them a little bit, cover them back up, and that's when I start the water boiling. And once the water starts boiling, they'll have done their second rise, and then I can put them in the water and boil them for about 11 or 12 minutes on a side. I use chopsticks to aerate, and one of the things I want to start doing is using a steamer, but I don't have a steamer right now, and the boil method is one I've always used, and I like the results. They're consistent. I've heard that using a steamer is even better, but that's one adventure I've yet to go down. So boiling is just fine. Poke them in, flip it when you're pulling it out. Poke them on the other side once they're out. Let them sit there and really kind of settle and cool. And then I actually have a knedlíky cutter, but I find that just using a bread knife is just fine. I used to think, I'm going to be super authentic and use the thread, but a bread knife works great. So I just let those loaves sit. It takes, because I do 4 loaves, and that's about 22 to 25 minutes a loaf. You want to get that right on the tail end of the rest of the meal cooking. So you don't want to make that wait. You want to get the timed out just about right. Once the bread is done, that's when I pull out the meat. I'm checking it to make sure that it's soft and tender. Sometimes with the lesser quality meat, you have to let it go a little longer to get as tender as you'd like. But once that's done, you can pull that out. You typically cover it in a bowl. And then I take everything else in the pan, and I'm going to strain it and just push everything through. There's different ways to do this. I've done it in ways where if I'm doing it on the stovetop instead of the oven, I will pull out like the allspice chunks and the bay leaves or whatever else. I'll pull all of that out, and then I'll actually just use an immersion blender and turn that into the sauce. But when I'm baking it, either roasting it or just full on baking, I'll pull all that stuff through a strainer and just squeeze it all through, and then what's left is either of the right consistency, or you could use the immersion blender to even make it more fine-tuned. As you see in this case, I'm not doing that. I'm just using that. But then I'll mix in sour cream, and once I have that all mixed in, I'll do that to color more than anything. So I wanted a certain color of orangish yellow. Once I have that done to the right consistency, it's ready to go. Now, there are other recipes that say, caramelize some sugar and put that in, do some lemon. I've seen ones that want you to cook with vinegar for the overall thing. And really, perhaps this should be a series of different recipes on how to make this, because there are so many variations you could do, and each one is valid and just as valid as the next one. And so that's 100% okay any way you want to do it. So then you cut up the meat, put on your plate, have your dumplings all cut up, put the sauce over all of those. In this case, what I do is take some heavy cream with the immersion blender when it's cold, and I turn that into whipping cream and put a blob of that on top. And then ideally, I'd put some cranberry sauce on top of that. But the week that I was doing this was in the middle of the pandemic, and I went to the store and there was no cranberry sauce to be had. In fact, I probably would have done this with a nicer cut of meat, but that was the only cut of meat I could find. So it's in some ways kind of like going back to the old days in Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, and just kind of cooking with what we could find. And I think it turned out really well. It was super good. I think most of the time when I make it, I definitely would have the cranberry sauce. But in this case, we do it with what we have, and it tasted amazing. Side-by-side comparison between my friend Vieira's and mine on the screen right now, and I couldn't have asked for a better comparison, a better teacher in some ways, but this is one of the great meals. Anytime I go to the Czech Republic, inside or outside of Prague, it's the first thing I order at any restaurant, and then I go off from there and order different things at different meals. But that's always the first thing.